I'm now joined by journalist Loveena Tandon. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Great to have you back on the show, Loveena. Let's talk a little bit, pleasure, about India's foreign ministry said it's not aware of any phone call between Narendra Modi and Donald Trump on Wednesday. Is this a challenging moment for US and India relations?
The challenging moment for India and US relations in this year started much before. I think it all started, not all, but it was simmering, but it has been added on to when India did not agree to the claim that President Trump made of having stopped the war between India and Pakistan. And then when Pakistan floated the idea of him being one of the person to win contenders for Nobel Peace Prize, India did not agree. And then tariffs came and India went and joined hands with China and Brazil through BRICS. And instead of bowing down, it really came on stronger with the rhetoric of made in India. So I think it's been going on for a while. This only adds on, and we'll see what kind of tariffs and HSB2C, whatever happens later now as we go along, because clearly there was no phone call as India claims.
Why has India refused to bow down to America's demands to stop buying Russian oil? Narendra Modi has not succumbed to this demand.
I think why should India bow down to anything for anyone? I mean, it is at this stage in its, let's say, life, if we may call it. It is touted to be the third largest economy by 2028. It has a huge market. It's one of the consistently economy that is delivering consistently 67% despite all that's happening. It has a huge market. So it has a lot to offer. Stable democracy that's been going on since it got its independence. So it has a lot to offer at this point in time. And they don't need, and they have, India has over a period of time positioned even more strongly and has pushed its agenda of non-alignment very strongly in saying that we work to our interests. So I don't know why they should be actually responding to someone wanting to, let's say, bully them out. But so I don't think India would need to listen to anybody. But yes, if gestures are made in a different way, it's more diplomatic, it's more suggestive and in more friendly manner, in give and take, I think it could listen.
Loveena, India relies on Russian crude oil, which Delhi has continued to buy at a discounted rate to support its economy. Is India funding Russia's war against Ukraine by doing this?
I think it's a very far-fetched statement to say that India is funding the Ukraine war or Russia-Ukraine war. And why has this kind of come now is the question. If you look at the statistics, as India depends, 85% of its energy needs or crude oil needs are dependent on importing the oil. And if you see at what's happening just in April to September 2025, the oil imports from India, the crude oil imports from Russia, have gone down from 40% to 36%. And they are more to do with the fact that the discount that Russia was giving has substantially come down. So it's a lot to do with what the needs and how the energy needs are met by India. Also, India is not the only one buying oil from Russia. It's Middle East, it's Turkey, and many other, and Europe is buying huge amount of gas from Russia, which has, one could say, been also contributing to the war. So it's not as simple as geopolitics and say suddenly India is the one that is fronting this war. But it is a lot to do with economic optics and also the fact that the US wants India to be buying more defense and more crude oil from them, and which India has actually increased. In the past the April to September, as I mentioned, the import from the US has gone up and import from Middle East has gone up to 45%, if I'm not wrong. So it is a little bit too far-fetched to say that India is the one that is the reason for this war to carry on. There are many, many more reasons.
And it's really interesting because we talk there about what happens if India stops buying Russian oil, but you made it very clear that lots of other countries are still buying oil from Russia, including Europe, which has been a criticism that has fallen on the Europeans. Is this a global effort that we need to stop the war in Ukraine?
Absolutely. And I think it is an opportunity that President Trump has been saying that he has stopped God knows how many wars. I think this is an opportunity. Zelensky is coming. They might want, that's where the efforts are required, and not to digress the attention to India fronting this war or anyone else fronting this war. No, the efforts have to go into diplomatic dialogue that needs to happen. And also, can I just say, if India today stopped buying oil from Russia, like immediately, cold turkey now, then it has to buy oil from elsewhere because it, as I said, it depends, 85% of its domestic needs depends on importing the oil. What will happen? It will increase the oil prices in the market, which will increase inflation in everywhere else, including the US. So it's not as simple. And that's why Biden administration had capped the price, oil price, the crude oil price for India. And it has agreed and has been doing, working in that cap. So it is not as simple as saying that stop oil India and the war is going to stop. If that was to happen, world would be a better place. There are many more things. It's a concerted effort that oil dependency has to decrease on X number of countries. There has to be more diplomatic dialogue. President Trump has an opportunity with Zelensky tomorrow. So, and whole Europe has been trying, in fairness, and there's gas needs. It has been trying to scale down its dependency, and it has done well. And so is India. India is also scaling down its dependency on crude oil. It is trying to make in India, well, it can't make oil in India, but it's trying renewable energy. There are a lot of efforts towards renewable energy, which is why the crude oil dependency on other countries is reducing as well. But we can't have simplistic answers to very complex geopolitical, economic problems like the war, which has been going on for now 4 years. And I still remember being reporting on the first day. So, yeah.
Very valid point. Loveena, Tandon, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For more on this, I'm joined by Derek Grossman, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. It's a pleasure to have you on this evening. Thank you so much for your time, Derek. Derek, let's just start with a simple question. Can the US president really pressure New Delhi to give up buying Russian oil?
Well, thanks for having me again. It's great to see you. I mean, I think the president is certainly trying to accomplish that, but will it work in reality? I mean, probably not. As your previous speaker pointed out, India is pretty against any country bullying it, as most countries are, but India is particularly interested in pushing back and ensuring its own not only non-alignment, but its own, sovereignty and territorial integrity. And those types of things, I think, make it such that India is going to be a very hard nut to crack. Now, that said, the United States has got obviously lots of different levers that it can pull in order to make India's life more difficult. And I think we saw that a few months ago when President Trump decided to not only put reciprocal tariffs at 25% on India, but an additional 25% tariffs as punitive tariffs for India's continued import of discounted barrels of Russian oil. So, but now look, the numbers show that that has not worked, right? That India continues to import discounted barrels of Russian oil at the same clip thereabout. There may have been a slight dip in the numbers, but certainly nothing that you could point to as, this is real proof that the policy is working. And so I think Trump is now going to maybe try some other tactics, such as what we, saw yesterday with him saying that India has agreed to stop importing those discounted barrels of Russian oil, right? It's kind of this is a Trumpist way of doing things, right? Making an announcement without actually having an agreement, and then putting public pressure on the country in question to actually make good on Trump's public announcement. I think it's kind of a strategy that doesn't really make sense. It's putting the cart before the horse. And like your previous speaker also said, I mean, it is a bullying tactic, which India never takes kindly to.
Derek, I want to talk to you a little bit more about that 25% that you did mention there, because if Modi agrees to stop buying Russian oil, could we see the US remove the extra 25% tariff it put on India for refusing to stop buying Russian oil, if that makes any sense? Because I think that's a big question happening, because we know India now has 50%, but possibly this could be the way of them negotiating to have less tariffs on the country, and possibly Donald Trump could use that.
Yeah, well, I think, in private discussions between India and the US, whether it's Modi and Trump in the past or, at a lower level, there certainly is this notion that, or I guess agreement, that India over time will start to buy less Russian oil, right? And we're actually we're not there yet, but maybe by the end of this year into next year, assuming that the war is still going on between Russia and Ukraine, having India spend less money on Russian oil and more money on American oil and oil from other sources, I think that's certainly the goal. And India has intimated that, but at the same time, it's a longer term process. Because of the way the global supply chain works, right? It's not easy to just say, okay, we're gonna stop doing it right now and that's it, right? I mean, it's got a long lag time. Also, there's the issues of the last few months, right, where Trump has taken a wrecking ball to the U.S.-India relationship, and so the political optics don't really help India making that sort of decision in this particular moment, or at least publicizing that it is. I think another factor here that we haven't talked about yet is the likely potential, I would say, for a U.S.-India free trade agreement, and that's something that Trump has really wanted. My understanding, and Modi wants it as well, my understanding is that there is a draft agreement that is basically waiting to be signed, right? So the two leaders, whenever they meet next, my understanding is Trump won't be going to India for the Quad this month, right? It may bleed into next year. But whenever the two leaders meet again, I think one of the policy deliverables will be to sign this FTA. And that, I think, will make Trump more confident in the fact that India is remaining a close strategic partner in spite of what it's doing with Russia and maybe what it's doing with China. And then in that case, he's going to, I think, try to relieve some of those reciprocal tariffs and those punitive tariffs. We're all trying to psychoanalyze Trump, obviously, right? So this is all subject to change. He's very unpredictable. He's very transactional. He's highly personalistic. So everything is really up for change. But that's kind of my view of it.
It's really interesting, because I do feel like we try to psychoanalyze Donald Trump and try to hang on every word and kind of make our own decision of what he's saying, or, it's a difficult situation, and thank you for explaining that. But if we talk about those free trade agreements that could possibly come into play when the two leaders meet, we know an Indian delegation is currently in the US right now, as I'm speaking to you, for these trade negotiations that are happening. But there's still major sticking points over trade between India and the US when it comes to things like farming. What more do we know about that situation?
Yeah, not much publicly, right? We just know sort of broad, topics that are still of concern. But But, I would say it's encouraging to see that the Indian delegation is in DC as we speak to continue to have these conversations. Of course, the devil is always in the details of any agreement, right? But like I said, the agreement is basically done, right? It's a matter of hashing out some of the finer details, which I think at this point should be the easier part, given that both leaders broadly agree with the direction that this is going in.
I wish I knew what was in that agreement, Derek. But I also just wanted to...
Me too.
No, both of us together. When it comes up, we'll have to discuss it. But President Trump has been a very busy man of late, and he's holding a telephone conversation with Vladimir Putin at the moment. He was actually on Truth Social talking about it while it was going on. And of course, that comes ahead of this meeting he's going to have with Volodymyr Zelensky tomorrow. And it was interesting because just yesterday, Donald Trump said Russia's economy was on the brink of collapse. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an opaque system we're dealing with in Russia, right? So it's kind of hard to know exactly what's happening there. I'm sure the president, through his President's Daily Brief and other intelligence briefings from the U.S. government and from the intelligence community in particular, are giving him kind of this analysis that Russia is in trouble. And so is, President Trump characterizing it exactly how it was described to him or written about in his briefing? That is hard to say. But I mean, for the fact that the president's saying that, I think there is something there, right? Something is going on, and we'll just have to kind of see how it plays out. But look, the India angle to it, right? I think your previous speaker had mentioned that India buying Russian oil doesn't support Russia's war in Ukraine. I would respectfully disagree. Right? It doesn't fully fund the war, but it certainly contributes to the cash flow that Russia needs in order to continue prosecuting the war, right? So from that vantage point, India certainly bears some level of culpability. But look, so does China, so does some of the European countries, right? So does anybody else who may be buying Russian oil or otherwise engaging Russia in violation of sanctions. So I'm not one who lives in a glass house, right? Because we know what happens when you throw stones and you live in a glass house.
Yeah, I do know what happens. But Derek, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. You mentioned China there, and China's really interesting because they obviously buy a huge volume of Russian oil. And China and Russia have always been quite closely aligned in many ways. Do you think Donald Trump will try to convince China to do the same thing, to stop buying Russian oil?
I mean, I think that's going to be part of the negotiations when he meets with Xi later this month on the sidelines of APEC in South Korea. But I mean, what are the real prospects of Xi Jinping doing that, especially when the U.S.-China relationship is still very strained? What's interesting, however, is that I think Trump wants some sort of reset with China, right? Not just on trade, but on other strategic challenges as well, to include, dealing with Russia. And I think there's going to be some conversation, at least from the president, on that. But I mean, there's a couple things. One, how interested would she be in doing that? I think pretty uninterested, given what we've seen since Trump came back to office. But also, there's, I think, a question about the extent to which this is a good thing for global peace and stability, if there is, in fact, some sort of reset. Because normally I would say resets are good, great powers should get along, especially if they're nuclear armed. That ensures the safety and security of everybody, right? But in this particular case, Trump clearly has a spheres of influence view of the world, that the U.S. essentially takes care of the Western Hemisphere, China takes care of East Asia, Russia takes care of Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe, hopefully not too much of Eastern Europe that goes into NATO, right? And then India takes care of South Asia and so on and so forth, right? The fallacy here is to think that everybody can just stay on in their respective corner of the planet and never really interact. But as you know very well, and as I'm sure most of our viewers know, we live in a globalized, highly interconnected society. And so it simply doesn't make sense. And in fact, a spheres of influence approach, right, that bends and breaks the international rules-based order, right, that's based on international law and norms of behavior. And that's exactly what Trump is interested in doing. Okay, that only will precipitate greater empire building by each of the great powers, and inevitably they will have more frictions with each other. And it's just, I mean, I can't help but point out the similarities between today's situation and the run-up to World War I and World War II. It was very similar in the sense that you had competing great powers. They were imperialist and colonial, no doubt, right? But they were still great powers that sought to offset each other and kind of stay in their own neighborhoods. How did that turn out? Not so well.
Derek Grossman, it's always fascinating to speak to you. I always feel like I learn so much. Thank you so much for your time.